Couple of logistical things before we start. Your assignments, your second assignment is going to be due on Monday, and your project proposal, one-page project proposal, is also going to be due on Monday. So for the project proposal, just make sure that you have a one-page. Just basically say what the problem is, what data sets you're going to be using, what you're trying to do, right? It's not really for us to do, the marking or anything like that. It's mostly for us to look at the projects and for TAs to look at the projects and give you some feedback. Okay? Midterm, well, we talked about midterm last time, so I will share with you some of the common mistakes next time, probably next Monday, once everyone has written the midterms and we'll look at some of the common mistakes that people have made. On the average, it wasn't so bad. Like, you guys did okay. Couple of questions before we start on the second homework. I think this is some of the questions that TAs have brought up. And maybe we can just quickly look at some of the problems very quickly before we get into the lecture. So some people are confused about overall concept of RBMs versus autoencoders. Okay? One big difference between two models is that RBMs are generative models. What that means is that you're trying to model the probability distribution over the input. That means that you can sample from the model. That means that if I give you a new example, a new digit, you can actually evaluate the log probability of this new example and say, is it probable or not probable, right? So if I give you even the adversarial example or some weird looking two, the model can estimate its probability and say, no, this is not a probable input. Autoencoders are really reconstruction-based models. Right? It's a compression mechanism. It's not generative model. I can't generate new images from an autoencoder. It really is how do I compress and how do I squeeze as much information as possible. Now, people do use them kind of in the same kind of flavor, which is you use contrastive divergence with one step, then it kind of looks like an autoencoder. And so the features that you're getting out of autoencoder, denoising autoencoder, contrastive autoencoder, and from RBM are kind of very similar. If your goal is feature extraction, then they are about the same. Okay? But in terms of the definition of the model, they are very different. Models. One hint I can give you, which is maybe could be useful to differentiate between the two models. Imagine that I have a data set, and my data set contains two images, A and B. Okay? Only two images, A and B. What would an autoencoder do? The autoencoder would try to get the features so that when you reconstruct, you put A, you reconstruct A. You put B, you reconstruct B. Right? That's what autoencoder would do. An RBM is not really doing reconstruction. It's trying to match the distribution. So if I have a model, magic model, an RBM takes an image of an A and reconstructs a B, and then it takes an image of a B and reconstructs it as an A, RBM would be perfectly fine with it, right? Because when you look at the statistics, the model basically says, the data distribution contains 50% image A, 50% image B. When I sample from my RBM model, it's 50% A, 50% B, so that's good. Yes, question?
How would you compare it to a variational autoencoder?
Yeah, we'll talk about variational autoencoder. This is another class of generative models, but it has different semantics. It's a directed generative model, whereas RBMs are undirected. So there are some differences between different classes of models. But again, it depends on what you're going to do. So today we're going to look at sparse coding. And sparse coding models are non-probabilistic models, but they design, again, for feature extraction. Autoencoders are also non-probabilistic models. And again, they design for feature extraction or for compression. RBMs are really generative models. You're just trying to model the distribution of the data. And it has a lot of interesting applications, again, like novelty detection or being able to do pattern completion. Later on, I'm going to show you some examples of a deep both machine where you can generate, if you have part of the image is occluded, you can generate the remaining part. This is something that autoencoders would not be able to do unless you train them in a very specific way. CD algorithm, Gibbs sampling. Contrastive divergence algorithm uses Gibbs sampling. So contrastive divergence algorithm is not Gibbs sampling. Contrastive divergence algorithm is basically saying run the Gibbs sampler for k steps and look at the sufficient statistics, right? Look at the positive phase and negative space and just do the update. So it's just the algorithm. Gibbs sampling is what later, I think in this course, we're going to look at Markov chain Monte Carlo. I think I'll have at least one lecture on MCMC methods for doing inference in these models. So Gibbs sampling is just, again, the algorithm for sampling from the model. For your homework, for your second homework, you're going to start at random configuration. You're going to run your Gibbs sampler for case, for 1,000 steps or whatever, 10,000 steps, and you will start seeing samples from the model, right? Very quickly, continuous versus binary inputs in RBMs for you and how to calculate cross entropy. So there's been a few questions on how do I calculate cross entropy, reconstruction cross entropy. So the thing about RBMs is that in RBMs we can't really compute probability of X because we don't know what the partition function is, right? It's very hard for us to compute the partition function. So instead, as a proxy, people tend to use a reconstruction loss, which is not the right metric, as I mentioned, because the model can, again, reconstruct A's and B's and B's and A's, and the reconstruction metric would be terrible. But the model is actually modeling the distribution of the data correctly. So whenever you're looking at the cross entropy reconstruction, what you do is that you have an X, which is your input, your digit. Now, the digits that you have, they are binary, but not quite, right? They are pseudo-binary. Like sometimes you have 0.9 as a pixel value instead of 0 or 1. That's okay. Remember in your first homework, you were dealing with a situation, what if I give you the targets that are not binary, but like 0.9? So that's okay, because you don't need to worry about it for this assignment. You can just take your X, whatever the form it comes in, you sample the states of the hidden variables, right? And if you want to do contrastive divergence, then you sample the states of the observed variables. This is your reconstruction, stochastic reconstruction, right? But when you're looking at the cross entropy, you're actually looking at predictions. So you're given the X, you sample the states of the hidden units, you compute the logistics for the reconstruction. Because that's your prediction of what the pixel values should be, right? Some of them would be 0.8, some of them would be close to 1, some of them would be close to like 0.001 and such. So for computing the cross entropy, you don't actually use you don't actually stochastically sample the reconstructions, right? Because you just remember, what is the cross entropy? Cross entropy is saying this is the truth, and this is my prediction. My prediction cannot be 0, 1. My prediction are the probabilities, right? So cross entropy is truth log of the probabilities. Okay. Now for your homework, typically just for stability, you might want to add a very small epsilon, so you never kind of take log of the 0 or anything like that. Because sometimes the probability of predicting a particular value in the pixel might be very small, like 0.0001. If you take the log, it could be a very large sort of number. So sometimes people just add little epsilon, maybe 10 to the minus 5, to make sure that you don't hit overflow issues or underflow issues. Okay? Does that make sense? Yes?
How do you normalize your input data for RBM?
Yeah, there is no normalization for your problem because your data is already normalized. It's between 0 and 1. If you were to work with real value data like images, then you would subtract the mean divided by standard deviation to make it more normalized. I mean, to make it normalized. But for this problem, you don't need to normalize, right? So I think that the question about cross entropy, people were confused. Well, if I go up, sample the states of the hidden variables, and I sample the states of the observed variables, and now I have zeros and ones here. How do I take logs of zeros, right? But you don't, when you compute the reconstruction loss, you don't sample. When you're doing contrastive divergence, you do sample. But when you're just looking at the reconstruction loss, you don't sample. You just look at the probabilities, because that's the definition of the cross entropy reconstruction error. Problem 1, more details. Problem 1 is kind of looking at the convolutional model, and I think that this question is supposed to be very easy. So if you're thinking too hard, you're probably overthinking. It really is just one convolutional layer, one pooling layer. After you get the pooling layer, just flatten this pooling layer, connect to the output layer, which is a softmax layer, maybe K classes. Just assume you have K classes, assume you have L classes, and that's it. Okay, so try to think as simple as possible. Don't overcomplicate. The reason I put this particular problem is for you to just basically look at the backprop algorithm for convolutional nets and figure out how do you do parameter sharing, right, across multiple locations. If you want to be precise, because some students also want to be very, very precise, just write down the assumptions that you think you should be making to derive the updates. The real goal for this question is for you to really just look at how backpropagation is being modified, okay? Don't overthink about it, because some people were thinking, well, what if I use the stride of 2 versus stride of 3? Like, what stride I should be using? I don't think it matters that much when you're kind of deriving the general backpropagation algorithm, okay? Problem three has to do with the graphical model. I think that in this case, just look at the slides. We've covered pretty much the model that's on the homework for graphical models. And again, it should be a fairly straightforward question. It has to do with denoising. So it's kind of just, and again, the derivation should be very straightforward. I think that out of the whole assignment, the last part, the RBM part, is probably more difficult because it will require you to kind of play with the model. And unfortunately, some people are asking, you know, I'm getting, you know, cross entropy of 60. Is that good or bad? The real answer is that I don't know, because I don't know how you're scaling things, right? So is it per example? Is it per pixel? Are you using mini batches of size 100 and then you averaging, or you adding? So depending on how you compute the gradients and what your objective function is, it can, you know, it can vary, right? Like if I use the mini batches of size 100 and I add all the gradients, I'm going to get one number. If I use the mini batch of size 200, then it's going to be twice as big, right? So in many cases, you know, typically just look at quantities such as you start with some cross-entropy reconstruction. As you go, you know, as long as it drops, you're probably doing it correctly. And ultimately, once you build these models, look at the features that the model is learning. Also look at the sampling. Once you sample from this model within 1,000 steps, some people saying, well, after 10,000 steps, you should start seeing some kind of digits. I know that you're only working with 3,000 images. You're not working with 60,000, which is the data set itself. But roughly speaking, you should start kind of like seeing the shapes of the digits. And again, and that's what it means to have a generative model, right? Because if you sample from the model, you'll start actually seeing from noise, you start seeing images of digits. Okay? Any more questions? Yes.
So I think the real question in the problem 1 is like, let's assume that you have m elements for the pooling, but the question mentioned that the SOMAX has a set of L. So this L and M must be equal in order to fit the...
Sure.
Yeah, but it's not mentioned in the question. I mean, the M is equal.
If you think that L and M should be equal, just put it in the assignment and say this is how I'm going to do it. Then it's perfectly fine.
By definition, the SOMAX do not do the FC, right? So you just switch in the input to the 0 and 1. So
sure, but at the same time, again, think of it as the following, right? You have a convolutional layer. After convolutional layer, you have a pooling layer, and you're pooling over some region. You know, what is it, k by k or whatever that number might be. You're pooling over some region. Once you get out of the pooling layer, how many units you have, you just flatten them and feed them into the k-dimensional softmax. Right? Think of it.
This K or L in the question is not useful.
Sure.
So it's not really
I'll have to look at it. I'm not sure. But at the same time, you know, whenever you do the first assignment, again, don't overthink too much. Think of it as just a neural net with one convolutional layer, one pooling layer. And after that pooling layer, you basically have a softmax, maybe a k-dimensional softmax. Think of like classifying images into k classes. That's all. Yes?
For the denoising autoencoder, you have, when you're going on the forward pass, you have this mask that you apply to the input.
Yes.
Does that mask change things when you're doing backpropagation as well?
No, so you can think of it as the following, right? Your input, when you corrupt with your noise your input, right? Your backpropagation is really just going from this input to the clean output, right? So you don't backpropagate through the noise, right? It really is basically saying, given an input that's partially, there is noise in the input, you're just trying to predict the clean input from the noisy input. So it doesn't really require any changes to the backpropagation algorithm. Yeah. And I think that part of your assignment, you'll implement that as well. Yeah. So hopefully you'll start seeing that denoising autoencoders can give you better features. Or at least when you start visualizing what you're learning, you should be able, as a hint, you should be able to see something a little bit better. It's a much harder problem to solve for the autoencoders. Any other questions? Okay, so today we're going to look at, last time we started looking at the autoencoders, right? And, or at unsupervised learning. And we've considered restricted Boltzmann machines, right? We've considered autoencoders. And today we're going to look at sparse coding. We might not get through the entire model, but sparse coding models, these are quite old models, about 20 years old, but so far they've been extremely successful, probably even more successful than autoencoders and restricted Boltzmann machines in terms of extracting interesting features. For those of you who are interested in neuroscience, these models were really inspired by neuroscientists. So sparse coding was done by Bruno Olshausen and Phil back in '96. And these were neuroscientists. And it was originally developed to explain early visual processing in the brain, looking at the edge detection. And here's the idea. For each input X, you're going to find a latent representation H. So you're going to find the hidden state H such that it's sparse. The vector H has many zeros. So you want your representation to be sparse. Kind of like in a restricted Boltzmann machine. When you sample the states of the hidden variables, you end up with a binary representation, right? Mostly zeros and then some ones. So here it's the same kind of idea. You want to be able to get the H's that are sparse, but at the same time, you want to have good reconstruction of the original input, right? So I want to be able to reconstruct from sparse input. I want to be able to reconstruct back my original input. And I'm going to have a matrix D that relates hidden states to the observed states. And D is sometimes known as a dictionary matrix. Okay, now, how do we set up the problem? This is the problem formulation. What we're going to do is we're going to say we have some data set of T inputs. If we look at this particular term, this is the reconstruction of X, right? Given some hidden state, given some D, I want this term to be as small as possible, and I want to minimize over D, right? So this looks at the reconstruction error. And this term here is basically a sparsity penalty term, right? It's an L1 regularized, and you're basically saying I want most of the elements to be sparse. And so notice that we have two minimization problems, right? One is you're trying to minimize over H. So this sometimes is known as an inference problem, right? Given the data, find me H such that I have a very good reconstruction. And this will become kind of a learning problem. Find the parameters of the dictionary matrix D, right? Such that we can have this reconstruction. And this is sparsity versus reconstruction control. So lambda key is basically having control how much reconstruction you want to have versus how sparse you want your representation to be, right? Okay. We can also constrain the columns of D to be of norm 1. I usually kind of ask you the question, why do I need to do that? But you already have the answer, which is there is kind of like a degeneracy problem here, right? If I multiply D by 100 and I divide H by 1 over 100, then it's the same thing, right? So you need to force D to you need to enforce additional constraints on the parameters. So typically people saying, well, I want to make sure that the columns of D have to be of norm 1. Okay, and we'll come back to that point. In fact, that's true. If you don't enforce this constraint, the optimal solution would be to make D be very large and to make H to be very small. Because this is the penalty, it's not right. This penalty is not measuring the number of zeros, so it's not L0 norm. It really is just forcing you H to be very small. Right? Remember, we've talked about L1 regularization, right? So, so we need to enforce that constraint. So what's happening here? Well, D is equivalent to the autoencoder output weight matrix, right? So you can think of the D as that given the hidden states, the binary hidden states, you're trying to reconstruct back the original input. But now H, the hidden states, which is a function of X, right, is going to be a very complicated function of X. In fact, in order to get this function, you have to explicitly perform this minimization problem, right? So if you think about autoencoders, what are the autoencoders? Autoencoders have an explicit encoder function, right? Given the input, you encode the hidden states. And then given the hidden states, you have an explicit decoder, so both are parametric functions. In a sparse coding model, there is no the decoder is very simple. It's just a linear decoder. Given the hidden states, I multiply by D, I get my original input. But the encoder is a complicated, nonlinear function of X. In fact, the only way to write this function of X is to perform this minimization problem, right? And this is L1, I guess. This is a lasso problem, right? Everybody sees that? So the encoder is this sort of an implicit encoder, which basically means that inference in this model can be quite slow, right? I give you an input X, and I tell you, what are the features I see in X? Well, you have to solve L1 lasso problem in order to find these features, okay? So in sparse coding, you have sparse features, you have an explicit linear decoding, but given the input X, you have an explicit nonlinear encoding. So you have sparse over complete representation of H. Typically, H is sparse, but typically the dimensionality of H is much larger than the dimensionality of the input. Encoding is implicit and nonlinear function of X, and reconstruction is just a linear and explicit. Okay, that's sort of the idea behind sparse coding models. Now, let's just see. Sometimes we can also write the sparse coding as follows, right? We can say, well, let's say that I look at my reconstruction, X here, and let's say I have my hidden states, H. Somebody gives me the hidden states. Now, what's the reconstruction looks like? I'm just going to be summing over the columns of D such that these H's are non-zero. Right? Obviously, if the H's are zero, then they don't contribute to the sum. Note that H's here don't necessarily have to be binary. They can be real valued, right? And that's one of the strengths of sparse coding model is that you basically have real valued hidden states, but mostly zero. Okay? And so, for example, the way that I can write 7 is I can say, well, 7 is really consists of a whole bunch of these features, almost edge-like features, right? So these are columns of D, and these numbers here are given by the H's, right? And just to sort of like point out that some H's can be not necessarily be binary 0 or 1, but can be you can have any other value. Yes, question.
The H should be negative.
The H, the H can be negative. Even generally, there's been some work that basically forces H's to be positive, but in general, they can be they can take any real valued numbers. Yes?
Can you switch the order of the minimize? Like if I minimize D first, then minimize H?
We'll come back to this. there is a reason for why we want to minimize over H and then minimize over D. It's kind of like comes back to EM algorithm, expectation maximization algorithm, if you've heard about this, but we'll go through the derivation. Okay? So D is often referred to as a dictionary. So there's been a whole bunch of papers written on dictionary learning. And it's actually a pretty popular model because you can formulate it as, the optimization can be done in a fairly efficient way, and you can actually extract very useful features. People have shown these kinds of models, not just for images, but text. You kind of like get interpretable features and so forth. It's a speech the same way. So D is often referred to as a dictionary. In some domains, we might know what is the dictionary matrix to use, right? What our dictionary matrix is. But in many applications, we don't have it, and so we have to learn it, right? So we have to effectively learn the parameters of the decoder, and we have to do the inference, which is trying to figure out the states of the hidden variables, right? So compared to, for example, restricted Boltzmann machines, how do we do inference? Well, given the data, you just sample the states of the hidden variables, so you basically have inference for free. In autoencoders, the same way. Given the input, you just encode. You have a parametric encoder, so you have the inference. For these models, we don't have that. So sparse coding, if I take these image patches, little image patches, I think these are 28 by 28 image patches, and I do sparse coding on these image patches, I can get something like this. I can learn like little edge structure. And that basically, and then if I show you a new example, much like I've shown you in RBMs, I can basically say, well, it's made up of these features. And then this new example is, again, can be represented as a sparse representation of, in terms of these coefficients, which gives us a good feature representation. But these kinds of features that you're seeing here, back in the late 90s, people were very excited about sort of learning these features because we believe that's the right representation to use in the visual domain. And there's been some neuroscience studies that it's believed that the V1, the visual area, when in human brain, when we start processing the brain, the cells in our V1 visual system are basically have kind of this type of structure. At least they respond, different neurons respond to different orientations and different edges. So it seems like we as humans are, at least the first very low visual processing is for us is to really detect edges and find where the corners are and stuff like that. Because it tells us something about objects, at least at the low level processing. So this was very exciting. There's been a lot of work on looking at sparse coding models. Now, let's look at the problem of inference. So given the dictionary D, how do we compute the states of the hidden variables H? Well, we need to optimize this particular objective with respect to H. And this is just a lasso problem, right? Remember, I think in our first couple of lectures, we've looked at the lasso very quickly. This is just a lasso problem. And remember, instead of having L2 regularizer, we actually have L1 regularizer, right? So we're kind of going to be hitting, hopefully, 0. And we could use gradient descent method. In fact, you can just take the gradients of this objective function, right? So this is a standard from the squared loss. And in the gradient of the L1 is just the sign of H, okay? So if it's positive, it's just basically the +1 or -1. That's it. Very easy, right? Gradient of absolute value is just a sign. So now, for a single hidden unit, you can basically differentiate with respect to a hidden state. You have this thing. Now, one issue is that L1 norm is not differentiable at 0, right? And remember, when we looked at rectified linear units, we kind of have the same problem. The function is not differentiable at 0. And in the cases of ReLUs, we basically say, who cares? We're never going to hit that 0 point anyways. Like the probability of you landing at 0 and not knowing what to do is 0. right? It's very unlikely for the gradient descent to land specifically on 0, even if it's a solution, right? But that becomes a little bit of problematic for this particular setting, because we actually need to take care of what happens. Like, we want our answers to be 0, so what do we do? And the solution is the following. The idea is the following. If H changes the sign because of the L1 norm gradient, right? It's because of the second thing here. It's changing the signs. Then we're basically going to clamp it to 0, because the optimal solution here would be 0, right? Because if we sort of like go and then we just jump across, then that means that, we should be setting it to 0. And so now the updates for every single unit is performed as follows. You basically change the hidden state. This is update from the reconstruction, right? The reconstruction part. And then you basically do the following. You're basically saying, well, if the sign of your current state, H, is not equal, so if you're flipping the sign between your hidden state minus what's coming from the gradient part, what's coming from the regularization part, then you clamp it to 0, right? And this is the update of the sparsity term. Otherwise, you just do the regular gradient descent, right? So it's a very simple algorithm. And it really is just basically saying that update the H, the hidden units. If the signs are changing because of the second part of this problem, because of the L1 norm, then set it to 0. The optimal should be 0. Now, in terms of implementation, how do you implement it? This particular process corresponds to something that's called ISTA algorithm, which is iterative shrinkage and thresholding algorithm. And if you look at the literature, there's a whole bunch of different variations of this algorithm. But in a nutshell, it's actually pretty simple. So you initialize your H's. For example, you initialize all your H's to be 0. And then you update your H's from the gradient descent update rule. And then you perform shrinkage operation. So what is a shrinkage operation? The shrinkage operation is just basically saying for a specific value b, which is the hyperparameter you have to choose, if you basically within some thresholds or within some distance to 0, you set it to 0, right? And this will converge if 1 over alpha is bigger than the largest eigenvalue of d transpose d. So it kind of has to do with the eigenvalues of your D matrix. And again, we're going to look at some of that later in the class. Yeah. So in a nutshell, it basically, if you think about it at the high level, this is the algorithm, but at the high level, it's basically saying you basically look at a small neighborhood around 0. And once you hit the small neighborhood around 0, you clamp it to 0, basically. Yes?
So convergence has nothing to do with lambda?
No, because lambda controls the sparsity. How sparse you want your solution to be. Convergence, basically, if you think about lasso type of problem, this problem, it's a convex optimization problem. It's not nonlinear or anything like that. There's only one solution. For any fixed lambda, there is one solution, right? So now, ISTA algorithm updates all hidden units simultaneously, right? So you can update all hidden states simultaneously, but at the same time, it's a little bit wasteful if some of them already are set at 0. Like if your hidden units are already set to 0, there's no reason to update them, or if they're already converged. And so you can use the most promising, update the most promising hidden units. So there's been a lot of work, if you're interested in looking at coordinate descent algorithm, learning fast approximate of sparse coding, approximation of sparse coding. And this algorithm also has the advantage that it doesn't require learning rate. Right? So I'm not going to go into these algorithms, but there's been a lot of techniques of kind of like saying, okay, how can you speed it up? There's also been extension of doing an online learning, which we'll talk a little later about. But nonetheless, right now, at this stage, these algorithms are extremely fast, and they can scale to very large data sets. Okay, so this is an inference problem. Now, let's look at the dictionary learning, right? Like anybody can solve L1 problem, obviously. It's been around for a long time. Like anybody can solve lasso problem. Now, how do we do dictionary learning? Because ultimately, we actually want to learn the features. When I showed you this digit and I showed you these little edges, that's the dictionary learning part, right? So how do you find the right dictionaries? So let's look at our optimization problem, right? So I have a missing min there. I've lost one min in this equation, but that's okay. So let's do the following. Let's first make an assumption that H doesn't depend on D. Okay? Then we would be minimizing this problem, right? Because the second term, H, if it doesn't depend on D, then it doesn't matter to us, right? So we're just going to be solving this problem. Given the X and given the H, my hidden states, just find the best D so that I can have the best reconstruction. And we also constrain the columns of D to be of unit norm. And this is actually what we are going to be optimizing, right? Because I give you the hidden features, I give you the data, and I basically say, find me the matrix such that I can reconstruct from these features my original data, and I want this reconstruction to be as good as possible. So here we can be using something that's called projected gradient descent algorithm. So while D is not converged, we're going to be updating the D just using the standard gradient descent, right? So we still have learning rate alpha. It's just a gradient. That's a very simple gradient. And then we're going to be renormalizing the columns of D. So for each column, we're going to be projecting it back to its unit norm, right? So that's why it's sometimes called projected gradient descent, because we do gradient descent and we project it back into the space where the columns of D are of unit norm, right? And then again, we apply a gradient update again, and then we do the projection again. Okay? Very simple. You don't actually have to think about how do you do gradient descent if your columns of D have to be of norm 1 that much, right? You just do something silly, which is you just do gradient descent and then just project everything into your normal space. And again, you do gradient descent, you project it back to your back to your space. It's very simple to implement. An alternative method is to solve for each column of D in cycle, right? So this is known as coordinate descent. So you're setting the gradients of each columns of D to 0. So you're trying to solve, sometimes these approaches are called coordinate descent because you're picking one coordinate and you're solving it in that direction. You're picking another coordinate, you're solving it in that direction. So that's very different from gradient descent based algorithms. And here's a little bit of, let me see. Here's a little bit of a definition. You basically take the gradient. So the first row here, you're looking at the gradient with respect to a particular column of D. You set it to 0. And then you do a little bit of manipulation. So you're breaking down into two pieces, D that depends on columns of G, and then D that doesn't. You arrange it in two different terms, and then you can actually write the update rule for each particular column of D, right? And so that's the optimal solution for this one particular coordinate. It's the sum of the squares of your h's, and then almost what's looking like the difference between making a prediction without using column of D, how good your prediction is, and then scaling it up. Okay? The interesting thing about this particular algorithm is it doesn't need to specify a learning rate to update the matrix D. All right? And this is actually, it's been used a lot, coordinate descent is being used a lot in, a lot of different algorithms. You're basically saying, well, I have all of these parameters. I'm going to pick one parameter and optimize it. And I'm going to pick another parameter and optimize it. And I can perform these optimizations exactly. Because notice that this problem is convex for this particular coordinate. Right? So you're breaking it down into a whole bunch of convex optimization problems. In fact, the problems that you can solve exactly, right? So you pick the direction, you go to the minimum. You pick the next direction, you go to the minimum. Pick the next direction, go to the minimum. That's what coordinate descent algorithm is doing. So now we can basically rewrite it. And what we can do is we can just rewrite it in a matrix form. And again, later on, you'll go through the equations. For those of you who are interested, it's just, if you want to program it in Python or MATLAB, that's the way to do it. Where A is just the outer product, H transpose, and B, and again, an outer product of X, H transpose. This should actually look very similar to you. That's exactly what you do when you do RBM training, that piece, right? This piece, H transpose, is just looking at the correlations between the hidden states. And then you do the update. So you can write it down efficiently in using sort of matrix algebra. And so that leads to the following algorithm. While D has not converged, for each column of D, you perform the updates, and then you renormalize. Okay? So you pick the direction, you optimize for the columns of D, you renormalize. And this is referred to as a block coordinate descent algorithm. And again, it's an instance of coordinate descent algorithm because you're updating different block of variables at every single step. And the blocks here are the columns of D. And you can update them optimally in each direction, right? So the whole problem is non-convex. But when you're solving in the particular direction, you can have an optimal solution. Yes? Is a question? No questions? Yeah.
What's the benefit of using this method over the standard stochastic?
Yeah, good question. So what's the method of using this over stochastic gradient descent? Depends on how you implement. And also depends, how good you are in terms of finding good learning rates. So I've seen papers that use stochastic gradient descent and showed good performance. I've seen papers that use coordinate gradient descent and achieve good performance. It's really just two different algorithms. The nice thing about coordinate descent is that, as I mentioned, it doesn't require you to pick the learning rate. So it's one less hyperparameter to choose. So it really just becomes that if I want to find the optimum, I just implement this algorithm. I don't need to come up with additional learning rates. So some people prefer that because it's a very precise and doesn't require you to. Because in some cases, with the learning rate, you kind of have to play with the learning rate. Because if the learning rate is too high, then the algorithm will start diverging. If it's too small, it's going to be too slow. So it depends, again, how good you are in terms of picking the right hyperparameters. Now you have two steps. You have an inference step, which is given X, can you infer the states of the hidden variables? And you have a learning step. Given the states of the hidden variables, you're updating your dictionary matrix. So now you're basically going to be finding the sparse codes for all your data in the training set using ISTA algorithm, right? Iterative adaptive thresholding. And then you're going to be updating your dictionary, right? So you're setting up these things, and you effectively run block coordinate descent algorithm to update D. So you kind of do it in two steps. You first figure out what H's are given D, and then you figure out what D's are given H's. And now, again, you go back, re-infer H's. Given the new H's, you refeed D. Given the new D, you infer new H's, and so forth, right? So this is very much in spirit similar to expectation maximization algorithm. How many of you have heard about EM algorithm? Okay, good. If you haven't, it's a really good algorithm to look at because it's one of the basic kind of machine learning algorithms where in the E step, you infer the distribution of the hidden states. In the M step, you update your model parameters. Same thing happens here. In the E step, for every single data point, you infer the hidden states. And in the M step, you update your model parameters. And this particular algorithm is batch. It's not online. And for larger data sets, you'd like to update D after visiting just a few axes. So the algorithm that I've shown you so far, really just for every single training example, you infer the states of the hidden variables. Once you have the states of the hidden variables, you update the whole parameter matrix. But then, obviously, in the spirit of online learning or stochastic gradient descent, you can perform inference for the current point and update running averages for the quantities that are required to update D, right? And that's a common algorithm. And basically, once you figure out the hidden states, you can just update your parameters, and then you're essentially just slowly updating your D matrix as you go along, right? And this is just a linear combination of the previous matrix plus what this new contribution is and so forth. So typically B's, beta here would be another hyperparameter they have to choose, okay? Kind of like just accumulating a running average over these parameters. So here's the overall online dictionary learning algorithm for sparse coding. If you look at, this is the paper back in 2009, you infer the code, H, you update the dictionary. While D hasn't converged, you basically do multiple passes to update your dictionary, right? So if you actually implement this algorithm, it's fairly efficient, right? There are a few hyperparameters like beta, and when you infer the hidden states, you have to solve L1 lasso. But at the same time, if you think about it, the whole problem is not convex. But it's convex in each part of it, right? So given D, L1 lasso is a convex optimization problem, so you can solve it. If I give you H's, given the states of the hidden variables, and I'm just solving for D, that's a convex optimization problem. So effectively, I can solve it as well. So, so now you kind of like have these alternating optimization problems. Each one is an easy optimization problem because it's a convex optimization problem. So some people prefer this particular algorithm because it actually works really well in practice. Now, one of the areas, and in the space of neural networks, you kind of have to do the same, is to use some form of preprocessing or whitening the data. So before running a sparse coding algorithm, it's useful to remove some kind of structure from the data, obvious structure from the data. So typically what people do is you normalize your data so that it's zero mean and the identity covariance matrix. So you can remove your second order structure. And yes, effectively removing first and second order statistical structure. And that's commonly done when you're working with images or image patches. Particularly if you're interested in reconstruction or some kind of generative models. If you're interested in just classifying what's going on in the image, it doesn't really matter that much. But if you're interested in sort of modeling the statistical properties of the image itself, this is a very useful thing to do. So the ZCA processing is done the following. So let's say you have an empirical mean and the empirical covariance matrix. Right? So you can always compute it from your data. Just look at the covariance matrix of your data, D by D. Let's say you have D dimensions, so you look at D by D covariance matrix, empirical. And the ZCA transform each inputs this way. Right? So U is the eigenvalue eigenvector representation of the matrix. And if you look at this thing, you're basically doing some form of whitening, right? And this is used a lot in a lot of different application areas. Like whenever you're working with time series data, whenever you're working with speech data, it's a very commonly used technique. So why do we do that? Well, if we actually do this preprocessing, then the empirical mean is going to be zero, right? And you can just do it. You can just basically say, well, what if I just look at this representation, I subtract the mean, obviously that's going to be zero, right? So you just push the sum inside, take the average, so the empirical mean is going to be mean zero. But what more importantly is actually if I look at the covariance matrix, right? If I do this preprocessing of my data, and I look at my covariance matrix and I kind of just do a little bit of algebra, I can show that the covariance matrix is going to be identity. That's why it's called you're removing first and second order moments. So if I apply this transformation to every single x, And that's a very good kind of a sanity check when you're coding these models. Because once you do the transformation, you can just compute the empirical covariance matrix again, and it should be identity. Okay? Now, sparse coding is typically also very useful for extracting features from your data. So given a labeled training set, X and Y, you're going to be training a sparse coding model on training inputs X. It's unsupervised, right? You don't need to have labels Y. You're typically just training on in unsupervised way, and that gives you H1. So it gives you the hidden states H1. And then given the hidden states, you can basically apply your favorite algorithm, training algorithm, classification algorithm, right? Now, in general, if you're training if you're interested in classification problem and you have enough data, you can use convolutional neural nets and the feed-forward networks, and they typically work better. But these kinds of models are also very useful in the cases where you have lots and lots of unlabeled data and very few labeled examples. So you can use lots of unlabeled data to extract, the representation, much like, extract like edge-like representation or stroke-like representation in completely unsupervised way, and that turns out to be very useful for, for a lot of downstream classification tasks, right? And you can infer the sparse representations and then basically feed them to the classifier at test time. Here's an example. I think I've shown you this example. I'm not sure of, these are the learned dictionaries. And now what you can do is you can take and just apply, much like you apply in convolution to every single, and my PowerPoint has crashed. Let's just see if it's crashing. Somehow the animations are not, it's not responding. Somehow sometimes the animations, when I do animations, it's just becoming worse and worse. Let's see if that animation actually makes it okay. So you can slide it across the whole image, right? And you can get these feature maps. It's exactly what you would do when you do convolutional neural networks, right? So typically sparse coding models are trained on, image patches, small image patches. So you can extract sort of interesting structure. And then if you apply this filter over here and next filter over here, you get these different representations. And then you can, plug a SVM classifier. This is how things were done back in 2016. Oh, back in 2006, almost 20 years ago. Wow. I remember this paper. That's pretty bad, right? It's like, no, it's 10 years. Oh, it's not so bad. 10 years is not so bad. And so you can get, much better results than doing sort of simple PCA preprocessing or kind of like building a logistic regression. So for a lot of different applications areas, again, people are using that, particularly in cases where you don't have a lot of labeled examples. It's a very powerful technique. If you do sparse coding on MNIST data sets, this is the kind of structure the model is discovering, which is pretty interesting, right? For your homework, I don't think you'll be able to discover quite clean of a structure as this one. Like you'll start seeing some edges, but probably not as clean as sparse coding. So sometimes sparse coding can give you very, very nice looking features. And then there is a paper called self-taught learning, which basically said, well, you train a sparse coding model on handwritten digits, and then you can use these features to classify handwritten characters. So this comes to the problem of almost like a transfer learning. Can you train a model on digits and then see how well can you do in terms of recognizing characters? And they've shown that, if your training set sort of like grows, then instead of from raw, you go to the sparse coding, there is some improvement there. Actually, PCA works quite well as well. But this was one example where it turns out the features that they were learning were a little bit better than just using raw pixels, right? So there was a little bit of transfer happening here. So just interpreting sparse coding again, just let me emphasize again, what the sparse coding is doing is that the decoding function, it's explicit linear decoder, the encoding function is nonlinear. And it's a very complicated nonlinear function, right? Because the only way to write this function down is to write it as a sequence of the optimization problem, L1 optimization problem. So the encoding is very powerful. The decoder is very simple. And so that really comes back to the problem of encoding, decoding, right? What exactly do you put in the encoder and what exactly do you put in the decoder? And we have a feed-forward, bottom-up, or we have generative top-down. So sometimes people would think sparse coding models is also a generative model because given the features, I can actually generate back the original input. Now, and the details is what goes inside of each different algorithm matter, right? And whether you're looking at RBMs, autoencoders, sparse autoencoders, denoising autoencoders, sparse coding models, all of these models are kind of fall into the same architecture. And exactly what goes inside is what differentiates these algorithms. Now, I think I've shown you this example before, but I wanted to come back to this. This is a model called predictive sparse decomposition. Let's look at the equation. What these guys were doing is actually pretty interesting. They were basically saying, okay, let's look at the decoder part. The decoder part is the sparse coding model, right? Look, forget about this part here. Forget about the encoder. If we just look at the decoder, it's a sparse coding model, right? What's wrong with sparse coding model? Well, what's wrong with the sparse coding model is at test time, I give you an image, right? And I want to get the solution like this. Like, what is the class of this image? I want to get features very quickly. And if you tell me, well, I'm going to run this offline L1 optimizer, it's going to take me 10 seconds, let's say, for this image, then it's not very useful, right? So what they were doing, they were basically saying, you know what? Why don't we find the parameters W such that this encoder tries to match the solution of the L1 regularizer, of the sparse coding model. So imagine I give you sparse coding, right? I find the states of my hidden states, sparse hidden states. What they were trying to do, they were trying to basically say, you know what? If I could fit the parameters W and approximate this model parametrically, then at test time, what can I do at test time? Well, at test time, I don't have to solve this problem. At test time, I can just do this. And that already gives me a good approximation of the lasso. You can also use it to warm start if you really want to solve sparse coding problem. You can use this to get a rough estimate of Z, because that's what you're optimizing over, and then solve lasso. Right? So, and they formed it as one big optimization problem. Basically said, given Z, these two problems are separate. This is encoder, decoder. So given the codes, I'm training encoder, decoder separately because they decoupled, right? And then if I want to find Z, I want to find Z that kind of satisfies this lasso problem. But at the same time, I'm also going to add the gradient to say, find me Z that's this guy's is close to as well. Right? Out of different solutions, pick the one which is more favorable to my encoder, right? And so this particular model was actually doing quite well. At test time, you can speed it up. At test time, you don't really have to solve L1. You can just warm start it by using the encoder. And then they were sort of like, they were stacking things up. They should be in encoder as well. I'm not sure what's happening to that. They were stacking things up and then basically building a feed-forward, essentially a feed-forward neural net model, or a feed-forward convolutional neural net. This was a way to pre-train convolutional neural networks from large volumes of unlabeled data before ImageNet, before we were able to get like lots and lots of examples with lots of labeled data. But these techniques are still very useful, particularly in the cases where you're working with settings where you don't have a lot of labeled examples, but you have a lot of unlabeled images. Right? Because you're trying to extract structure from the images. And this is just another example of trying to model the small regions, extracting from an image of natural, like in this case, it's a forest. And this is what the image patches would look like. Right? So these image patches that you're trying to model, and this is the image patches that you're trying to model. So these are called images of natural scenes because these are kind of scenes that you would see on the outside. And it's interestingly, when trained on natural images, there was a paper published, this is Bruno's paper, 96, this is what they've discovered. And that actually, surprised to some extent a lot of people, and it actually looked really good. And the dictionary columns atoms look like edge detectors, right? And you're doing it in unsupervised way. You're not really telling, classify this of this. It really is basically saying, if I want to be able to reconstruct the original input, it's finding edges. And each atom here, each particular point here, is tuned to a particular position, orientation, and spatial frequency. So you basically had a lot of things that were tuned at different orientations, different positions, different frequencies. These are high frequencies, these are low frequency, and so forth. So this is the kind of structure that emerged from sparse coding models. And it turns out, and you can look at the paper, it's one of the papers, one of the original papers that introduced this model. It looks like V1 neurons, as I mentioned, in the visual cortex in the mammalian brain. It includes, I believe it includes us as well, have a similar behavior. So people were actually, seeing that certain neurons in our brain are really responding to different orientations and different scales, as well as, different spatial positions of, there might be a neuron in your brain that just responds to this. Like every time you see an edge in a particular direction, it's kind of response. And just one final story before we finish is that once these results came up, then there was a lot of debate in the community. Okay, are we born with these pre-wired features, right? And if we are, maybe to solve the vision, we just need to wire these things up in our algorithms. And there were a bunch of people doing that. And there's been kind of like these deep hierarchical models before the deep learning kind of took off that looked at these hierarchical structures, because that was done in the late 90s, but they never worked quite well. And there was another experiment, I think it was done in the 50s, which unethically wasn't very proper experience. It was done, I don't remember where it was done, but they were trying to figure out, are we born with these pre-wired filters so that we can start detecting things, or is our brain actually learning what these filters should look like? So I think that what they've done in the 50s or 60s is that the newborn kittens, what they've done is they put a bunch of newborn kittens in a room where you only had vertical structures. And they were born in this environment, and they grew up in this environment. So the only thing they see is they see the vertical structure. They never see horizontal ones. And then later in life, they kind of put them in the environment where they had horizontal structure, and they basically observed that, animals were disoriented. They couldn't figure out what this structure was. So it seemed like the brain basically, we were probably born with something like this, but then there's fine-tuning stage, right? Which basically, to your environment, whatever environment you're living, the brain basically adjusts that for visual representation. Which is kind of was in favor of learning-based algorithms, because people were saying, no, I think we should learn what these things should be, depending on the task that you're trying to solve. And back in 2012, once these methods started performing really, really well, then people kind of said, well, we don't know what's happening in the human brain. Maybe we're born with pre-wired things, but in practice, it's always better to actually learn what these things are, depending on the task that you're trying to solve. And so it also suggests that the brain might be learning a sparse code of visual stimulus. That may well be the case. We don't know. But since then, once the paper was published, many other models have been shown to learn similar features, right? So RBMs, they kind of do something similar, convolutional neural networks, and so forth. So we sort of know that whenever you're processing images of natural scenes, your first layer features should kind of look like this. If they don't, something is wrong, generally, right? Again, if you're solving, and they usually incorporate the notion of sparsity. So that's kind of the belief right now, but you could probably take a neuroscience course and probably learn a little bit more about exactly what's happening. Well, actually, nobody knows what's happening with the human brain anyway, so. Okay. So next class, what I'm going to do in the next class, we're going to start looking at temporal data before we get into more complex generative models. We're going to look at language models, and then next week we're going to look at sequence models. A lot of these models, again, are going to be non-probabilistic, deterministic models, and then after that we're going to go into more probabilistic models.